Hello, everybody. My name is Konstantinos Misios, and I'm a PhD student at Interflow Group. Interflow Group is a research group at Department of Mathematical Sciences at Aalborg University, developing numerical methods for interfacial flows. And today I'm going to be presenting to you our recent development on using the isoAdvector geometric VOF method for interfacial flows through porous media. Before we get started, I would like to give a very short overview of this presentation. Initially, we are going to list some fields that involve interfacial flows through porous regions. Along with that, we will see what was the motivation of our study. Then we will go through the numerical simulation of such flows. There, we will see how the governing equations describe this sort of problems, and we are also going to talk briefly about the extension of isoAdvector. Finally, we will watch two simulations that serve as a validation to this new development. So, interfacial flow through porous regions can be encountered in a variety of fields like marine and coastal, or even groundwater and environmental flows. As you can imagine, in large-scale problems, analytical description of the flow field is intractable, while experiments sometimes face scale-up issues. It is therefore necessary to develop an accurate simulation tool for these sort of flows that can be utilized in the design phase and can prevent situations like this on this figure where a damaged breakwater is depicted. When simulating interfacial flows through porous region, there are two main paths that you can follow. One is to fully resolve the porous geometry, while the other is to model it. In order to fully resolve, you have to overcome some geometry-related issues. For example, you need to know what is the geometry that you're going to resolve. Apart from that, usually you will have to deal with large mesh counts, with a lot of small cells in the vicinity of the solid boundaries, and this leads to a computationally heavy simulation. As a result, this method is not feasible in large-scale applications like coastal and marine structures. On the other hand, we can take one step back and try to model the porous region presence inside the Navier-Stokes equations. This is done by dividing the domain into large enough cells like this hexagonal cell down here. And here the porous material is represented by an average porosity value that is assigned to the cell. Then the second step is to volume average the governing equations. And finally, to include source terms on the right-hand side based on the Darcy-Forchheimer theory to account for the forces exerted from the porous region to the flow. In this study, we followed the modeling approach. Regarding the governing equations, these are the volume averaged Ran's equations. Continuity is not affected from the volume averaging apart from this volume average velocity value. However, this is not the case for the momentum equation. Here you can see that porosity divides various terms like the temporal advection and the diffusion term, while you can also observe some source terms that stem from the extended Darcy-Forchheimer equation. In front of the temporal term, you can see the added mass source term, which is proportional to the fluid acceleration, while on the right-hand side, you can see a resistance force, which consists from a linear and a non-linear contribution. After the governing equation, also the advection algorithm has to be adjusted in order to account for the porous medium. This adjustment is done into two separate steps. Initially, the volume fraction has to be redefined because when a porous material occupies a cell, the void volume of a cell is not anymore its total volume. As a result, it has to be multiplied by its porosity value in order to retrieve the actual void volume. This action will keep the volume fraction field between 0 and 1. The second step is to account for porosity in the interface advection velocity. Since the interface has essentially a Lagrangian nature, the interface advection velocity is calculated as the intrinsic volume average velocity. In other words, the superficial velocity has to be divided by the porosity. And after this brief description of the theory that lies beneath the solver, it's time to see some simulation cases. The first benchmark is about a water disk depicted in solid gray that is passively advected through a porous region illustrated in this gray pattern block. The advection is done with constant diagonal velocity u. This porous block is a uniform and has a porosity value of 0.5. Scope of this simulation is primarily to evaluate the advection algorithm isolated from the momentum equation, and parallel to that, check shape preservation, boundedness, and volume fraction conservation. As the disk enters the porous region, it elongates in the advection direction, and the advection velocity becomes double. Afterwards, the elongated ellipsoidal blob is transferred back to its original shape as it gets out of the porous domain. And as you can see also here, but again, in these characteristic snapshots of the water disk, you can observe some contours related to the interface. In green are shown the alpha 0.99 and alpha 0.01 contours, while in blue is illustrated the 0.5 contour. And in red is depicted the theoretical initial interface of the disk. The interface remains very sharp since only 3 cells separate the 2 green contours throughout the simulation. And it is also evident that there is a very satisfying self-preservation since the final snapshot, the numerical and the theoretical interface collapse to each other and look identical to the naked eye. In this slide, we'll see some quantitative results related to the volume fraction conservation and boundedness of our new development. It is clear that the volume is conserved excellently with errors that stay below machine precision, while the bounding of the algorithm is also outstanding since again, we observe values close to the machine precision. This was a reasonable result since the base method that is extended during the study, namely isoAdvector, has a well-documented conservation and bounding properties. In the second benchmark case, we tried to reproduce the experiment of porous dam break that was conducted by Liu et al. Back in 1999. Here you see a simple dam break case with the only difference that now there's also a porous block present in the middle of the domain. There's a water column on the left side that is suddenly released. The porous block is uniform and has a porosity of 0.49. Scope of this benchmark is to compare against the experimental data and thus validate porous inter-isoform as a whole, meaning that the interface advection and the variance modeling are going to be evaluated all together. Here we can watch an animation of this simulation. Again, we use the same color palette for illustrating the water volume fraction and the alpha value contours. You can see that the water column is released and then this water volume encounters the porous block and it continues to flow smoothly through the uniform porous region until at some point the system finds an equilibrium. As we also observed in the previous benchmark case, here the interface remains again very sharp with only 3 cells separating the alpha 0.99 from alpha 0.01 contours. In this slide, you can see 9 elevation profile plots from different time instances during the simulation. It is clear that porous inter-isoform predicts the water elevation accurately in most of the simulation. There's a slight deviation in the initial phase that is presumably due to the modeling of the water gate. In the simulation, the water is released instantly, while in reality, it's a finite process that takes around 0.1 seconds. Again, the results regarding the volume fraction conservation and boundedness are very satisfying, with the normalized volume fraction error being a bit higher compared to the passive advection case. This rise is most probably connected to the pressure solver and its tolerances. The overshoot remains below the order of 10 to the minus 10, while the recorded undershoots are close to machine precision. So in conclusion, let me sum up the main points. This presentation was about our recent development, namely porous inter-isoform, a solver capable of simulating interfacial flow in and around porous media. The implementation carried out in the OpenFOAM framework. And for this development, the volume average runs and the Darcy-4-Keimer equations were employed. Apart from the governing equations adjustment, isoAdvector had also to be extended by the redefinition of the volume fraction fields and the interface advection velocity. The benchmark cases gave a clear outcome with satisfying performance in terms of accuracy, shape preservation, interface sharpness, and volume fraction conservation and boundedness, which are apparently properties inherited from the best interface advection algorithm, which is isoAdvector. So that was a brief presentation on the porous inter-isoform. Thank you very much for your attention.